to another show of historical fiction author chats. And today I'm very excited to welcome Roxanne Veletzos, my friend that we haven't seen each other like this in about a year since we did that really big historical auction or author chat with what, 6 of us, 5 of us?
Yes, there were 6 of us. Yes.
That was crazy. That was crazy.
And so even crazier that so much time has passed. It doesn't seem like that long.
But it's true. It's flown by. Well, I'm really happy you could join me for this one-on-one and tell everybody about your new book.
Thank you for having me, Genevieve. As you know, I adore your books. I love your writing. You're such an inspiration to me. So it's such a pleasure to be here.
Well, ditto. And so now I'm here to talk about When the Summer Was Ours. I'm going to read you Roxanne's bio and the synopsis, and then she's going to read to us. Roxanne Veletzos was born in Bucharest, Romania, and moved to Los Angeles as a young teen with her sister, parents, and 2 suitcases. Already fluent in English, she began writing short stories about growing up in her native Eastern Europe, at first as a cathartic escape while adapting to a new culture, then to build on what had become a budding passion. Before she began writing full-time in 2012, Roxanne worked as an editor, content writer, and marketing manager for a number of Fortune 500 companies. Her debut novel, The Girl They Left Behind, which I loved, based on her family's true story, was an international bestseller and was published in 10 countries. Roxanne now lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her husband and their 2 sons and 1 very spirited border collie. Border collies are the best.
They are.
Now, the synopsis for When the Summer Was Ours. Hungary, 1943. As war encroaches on the country's borders, willful young Eva César arrives in the idyllic town of Sopron to spend her last summer as a single woman on her aristocratic family's estates. Longing for freedom from her domineering father, she counts the days to her upcoming nuptials to a kind and dedicated Red Cross doctor whom she greatly admires. But Eva's life changes when she meets Aleandro, a charming and passionate Romani fiddler with a love for painting. With time and profound class differences against them, Eva and Aleandro will fall deeply in love, only to be separated by a brutal act of hatred. As their lives diverge and they are each swept into the tides of war and its aftermath, they try to forget what they had once shared. But as the years pass, the haunting memory of their romance will reshape their destinies and drive them to decisions which are felt through generations. From the horrors of the Second World War to the tensions of the 1956 Hungarian uprising and beyond, When the Summer Was Ours is a sweeping story about the toll of secrets, the blurred lines between desire and loyalty, sacrifice and obsession, and the endurance of the human spirit. It's beautiful, and I've read it, and I love the book. So now I'm excited to listen to you read to us. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Everybody out there, grab your tea and cookies, and we will listen in. Thanks, Roxanne.
So just a quick preface before I begin. I will be reading the first chapter in the book, which finds Eva in, a place in her life where she feels that she's got her future pretty much planned out. Yes, she finds herself in a turbulent time because war is coming closer to Hungary every day. But she's really at this point thinking about the future and her dreams of pursuing a medical career. And so in a way, in this first chapter, we kind of get a glimpse of really what perhaps Eva's life might have been had it not taken this abrupt turn once she arrives in Sopron. So here we go. Sopron, Hungary, summer 1943. As the Budapest streets, with their clatter of trams and hurried pedestrians, began to thin out, Eva César reclined against the cool leather of her father's town car and let out a long breath. 2 hours from now, she would be on her family's country estate in Sopron, with nothing to do but soak in some much-needed sun, bask in Dora's glorious cooking, and tackle, at last, the 3 biology books she tucked into her valise under layers of clothing, like boxes of stolen chocolates. It had been a maddening spring, filled with endless parties and dinner outings and a steady stream of thank you notes to write for the gifts arriving in elaborate packages for her upcoming wedding. She'd wrapped each one nonetheless, feigning delight, filled with an undercurrent of annoyance that with Europe at war, she should be receiving such lavish gifts. Endless bibelots, crystal napkin rings, stained glass vases large enough to fit all the flowers bouquet in Budapest combined. All, she imagined, would be stored in a pantry somewhere, collecting dust after the wedding. She wouldn't have much use for them in her new life with Eduard. The planning of the wedding itself had felt more like a negotiation of a peace treaty, obliterating any time at all she might have had for reading. Even the dress fittings, all 6 of them, she'd come to regard as a weekly trip to the dentist. At the last appointment, she did her best not to slouch or tap her foot or swat the tiny flies that seemed enthralled with the burst of tulle and lace on her shoulders. She'd have the overwhelming urge to push past the seamstress hovering at her feet and flee. Didn't this woman with a mouthful of pins and the concentration of a mathematician understand what was taking place outside of the rose-wooded panel walls of her shop? Didn't she know that while she insisted that every pearl on her 5-foot train should be fastened at exact intervals, men were trudging through the trenches without proper boots, dying in the Russian snow? Then she spotted a recent newspaper, folded in 3 on the low table near the sofa, strewn with patterns and rolls of silk, and she realized, of course this woman knew. Everyone in her family circle knew, yet they all seemed intent on looking the other way. Everyone other than her dear Eduard seemed far more consumed with the fact that chocolate eclairs had vanished from Budapest entirely, or that the shade hanky baths had become overcrowded. No one was concerned that tens of thousands of Hungarian soldiers had been killed at Stalingrad, with the new year still in celebration. Poor Eduard. As the car moved through the streets, Eva pictured him at the very moment, his head bent in concentration, pushing his round wire glasses back on the bridge of his nose as he extracted a piece of shrapnel from a soldier's shoulder. He planned to join her in Sopron until late in the spring, when what remained of the Hungarian Second Army had retreated from the Eastern Front and wounded soldiers began pouring into Budapest hospitals by the thousands. Of course, she'd agreed that he should stay for as long as he was needed. Besides, here under her father's nose, their every moment and conversation would be observed, their every word measured. There would be no Sunday strolls on Andrassy Ut, their arms intertwined, exchanging views on what might come to Hungary if its alliance with Germany was to continue. No coffee and Gauloise cigarettes at the brasserie across from Hero Square, where he would give her a detailed account of the latest tourniquet he'd applied and how, just as he was preparing grimly for an amputation, it had managed to stop the blood flow and save the doomed limb. Or how a bullet could enter the body in a way that endangered no organs, then splay under the skin like a trick flower pulled from a hat. As the car turned into the main highway and began closing the 200 kilometers that stretched between Budapest and Sopron, she sparked a cigarette and thought with some amusement of the day when her fascination with anatomy began. She was 80 years old, and on that Christmas Eve, among other gifts, she'd been presented with a brand new set of pencils and a coloring book. She sat at the kitchen table later that night with her book and a cup of hot chocolate provided by one of the servants. There, among the clattering of pots and pans and plates being scrubbed, she opened it for the very first time and wondered in that first instant if her uncle had picked it from the bookshop by mistake. It was a drawing book, but there were no flowers to fill in, no clouds or castles. There, in all its glorious form, Eva glimpsed the naked human body for the first time. Not just the body, however, but all it contained in its secret corridors, intricate maps of systems she never knew about. As Eva stared at the illustrations opposite of the blank pages she was to fill in, she marveled that her own body contained such complexities, that underneath the quiet smoothness of skin, blood pumped through mazes of veins, that everything from the muscles in her neck to the tendons in her toes was all connected in one perfect constellation. All night she spent copying the illustrations, the tendons, the arteries, the organs shaped like some strange exotic fruit. She hadn't noticed when the sun had come up, nor that her breakfast lay untouched on the armoire. It was only when she met Edouard years later that she was able to confess this obsession to anyone. She went to a friend's birthday dinner out of obligation as much as boredom. She expected the usual meaningless chatter as she stood around alone smoking a cigarette. Then she overheard the conversation taking place just on the other side of the fireplace. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but then she saw that the woman in the duo had grown quite quiet and looked at her in perplexity. The man, too, noticing the distraction, had glanced over his shoulder. There was a sort of gentility in the premature silvery strands at his temples, an earnestness in his clear blue eyes as he turned to her fully. "I'm sorry," Eva found herself explaining. "I'm just waiting for someone. Please don't mind me. I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting in the least," said the man. He held out his hand, and a tiny, amused smile that seemed at odds with his formal gesture appeared in the corner of his lips. "I'm Edouard." "Eva," she replied as she shook his hand, hoping that taking a drag of her cigarette in tandem would convey some mild disinterest. But she was interested, not necessarily in the way he looked, which was not exactly unpleasing, but in what she'd heard him say only moments earlier. "You're a doctor with the Red Cross." "I'm sorry." She found herself apologizing again and wished she hadn't. "I couldn't help overhearing that and, well, mostly everything else." "So it's true then. Our regent means to disentangle Hungary from the war, and he's already promised the Americans and the Brits to hold back on their aircraft." She took another drag of her cigarette, which shivered slightly between her fingers. "Incredible, isn't it? But is it sustainable? I imagine Herr Hitler will not take to this kindly." "True," said Edouard after a long pause. He looked at her as if suddenly observing him from a different angle. "But tell me, Eva, why would someone as lovely as you be interested in tracking political maneuvers?" "Why not?" she said, tipping her chin in defiance and tossing back the rest of her champagne. "Even someone like me," this she said in clear irony, "does not wish to see the Nazi flag flutter on Castle Hill." They ended up leaving the party together, catching a late night drink. In the dim lights of the tavern he insisted on, Eva noticed how alive he was talking about his work, which had begun in earnest even before he finished medical school. It occurred to her that perhaps he couldn't afford to take her to a better place. He'd earlier mentioned with surprising openness the school debts, which had been struggling to pay for years, and she felt warmed from within with something like enchantment, or perhaps admiration. To her own astonishment, she placed her hand on his. Later, he walked her home in a drizzle of rain, passing the darkened storefronts on Váci utca. The quietness of the night, with its faint sound of streetcars, seemed to embrace them in an intimate way. In front of her home, just half a block from the Opera House, he paused on the sidewalk to take in the tall windows and ornate Baroque facade, and she squeezed his arm as if to indicate that this, like anything else, was ordained by something that had nothing to do with them. He kissed her cheek and departed in a hurry, his shoulders scrunched against the October wind, shaking the mist from his hair as if to dispel the evening, which might have been no more than a dream. 4 months later, they were engaged. She knew it was rushed, yet ever since his proposal, when he declared that her presence in his life had spurned in him a desire to rise to the highest planes, a similar feeling had awakened in her as well. She was 20 after all, 20 and he perfect in every way. She couldn't have hoped for a better match. Besides, in the short time they'd spent together, she never became more certain of one thing. With this man at her side, she could shape her own future. She could make of it what she wished, and that, above all, had filled her with great exhilaration. The car, Eva realized with the start, had turned from the main highway and began its upward climb on the smaller road leading up to the villa. She hadn't noticed the time pass, yet here she was, on a land that belonged to a different world, with its lush trees and the calmness of a simpler life, and all the colors of a Cézanne painting. At the end of the long driveway, after they'd gone through the main gates and the villa revealed itself from the shade of oaks, she opened the car door and, before stepping out, she inhaled deeply. The Sopron air always smelled of fresh-cut grass and rain even at the onset of summer, that nostalgic, comforting air of her youth. Despite the chauffeur's protests, she pulled her own valise from the trunk, and as she slammed it shut, a familiar voice greeted her from the top of the stairs. Dora, her summer governess, was hovering under the arched door, breathing heavily as though she'd run a mile from the kitchen. "Oh, my dearest, you're here," she sang in her quivery voice, fanning her plump, ruddy cheek with one hand, while on the other, balancing a platter of her legendary baked strudel. "Oh, but look at you, soon to be a madame. Oh, come here, my love. Let me see you, my beauty." "My dearest Dora, hello," Eva shouted, laughing, running up the steps. "You're back. You don't know how happy this makes me." Dora lived in town, but every summer while Eva visited, Dora reinstalled herself at the villa, even though Eva had long stopped needing a nanny. If anything, they'd become close friends over the past years, and Eva couldn't wait to see her year-round. "You know, I think this will be a summer of great adventure for us," Eva said now, kissing Dora's flower-dusted cheek, even though she couldn't think of anything at all adventurous between now and early September. Taking a hearty bite of the strudel, she walked into the house with it, letting the powdered sugar scatter into the air like dust dancing in a slant of light. In the vast windows, the sun had already dipped beyond the hills, bathing the vineyards in shades of amber and gold, as she paused in the living room doorway to take it all in. This peacefulness, this splendor. Would it last? For how long? Sopron, she thought, after this summer, may never quite belong to her in the same way again. She turned and went up the staircase, thankful that at least for now, for 2 more weeks, while her father was detained in Vienna, the Sopron of her childhood belonged just to her. It was only hers and Dora's, and she intended to enjoy every languid, unadventurous moment.
Ah, that's neat. I remember that opening. I read your book a little while ago, so it's like getting back into the comfort of, in the snuggly place where you were comfortable before. Thank you for reading that. It's beautiful.
Of course.
And I know Dora is going to play quite a big role in the book going forward. And
yes,
it's really beautiful the way you've built their relationship. So I want to ask you, your last novel, The Girl They Left Behind, which congratulations on the huge international success of that book.
Thank you.
It's fantastic. The story was based on your family's history. What about this book? Where did this come from? What's your inspiration for writing this one? It's different.
So yeah, it is different. I think the main inspiration though has somewhat of a similar root. It really kind of really began with this deep interest that I've always had in the history of Eastern Europe, its modern day history, because that's where I was born and I spent the first 13 years of my life there. So much of what happened during this time period, during the war and during the years of the Soviet occupation, had a huge impact on everyone in my family and really sort of changed the course of their lives, and perhaps even mine today to some extent. So for me, there will always be this desire to write about this corner of the world, and about countries like Hungary or Romania in my first novel, and sort of what everyday people experience there. The other bit of inspiration for this novel actually came to me quite by accident while I was researching Romania's World War II history for my first novel, when I came across an article which talked about the persecution of the Romani during World War II, when apparently as much as a quarter of their population died at the hands of the Nazis. And For some reason, after reading this article, I sort of couldn't stop thinking about it and trying to absorb the magnitude of this loss. That 1 in 4 people of the largest minority in Europe, had died in these labor and concentration camps, often through horrible medical experiments. And yet, from what I could tell, very little had been written about it, especially in fiction. And in fact, as I dug through further research, I found out that some historians now refer to it as the Forgotten Holocaust, which is really quite telling. And I think on a more personal level, again, kind of tying back to my personal imprint on the book, I think the reason why this piece of information affected me so much is that as a child growing up in Romania, I was familiar with the Romani culture. I was a bit fascinated with their sort of, freedom and independent spirit, and their music above all, which I fell in love with since such an early age. And in fact, the Romani music plays a huge role in this novel. And so in a way, this sort of planted this early seed for this novel, because I felt like it was a story that I, again, not only had a personal connection to, but because it had not really been explored a great deal in fiction, that it was a story that I wanted to tell. And then just on a final note, I really wanted to write, I had this idea about this being a love story between 2 people from completely different worlds who probably should have never met at all, let alone fall in love. And through their experience of separation and hardship and loss, as they traverse together and apart these like decades of war and revolution, to kind of continue on with the same themes that were also in my first novel, which have to do with, sacrifice and the importance of family and friendship to kind of like save us in dark times, and the courage to reach for new beginnings after loss.
Yeah,
So that's it in a nutshell.
yeah. In a nutshell, that explains so much about it. I love. There's so many novels right now that are based in World War II, right? And
Tons, a lot, yes.
and you would think after a while people would say, oh, enough. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, because there's so many different ones. And I love that you took us to Eastern Europe to learn about them. And in specific, you were talking about the Romani. And there's such a mystique to those people. There's so, and as you say, the music, the culture, there's something romantic about the Romani. And I loved getting into that world and feeling a little bit of it. The research that you did on these people, was it new to you? Was it something that you were aware of? Because I know nothing about the Romanis except for this vision I have of them.
Yeah, so I did. There was one particular resource that was hugely helpful to me. I think it was, gosh, I'm trying to think of the exact name. But it had to do with the journey of the Romani in the Balkan states, kind of tracing through their history and the hardships that they endured, the way they sort of formed their own culture and held on to their culture so tightly because they were literally unaccepted by the larger society. And unfortunately, I think we still see that to a great extent today in Europe in particular, where they are still very much marginalized. And I think there's a bit of a love-hate relationship with the Romani in general in Europe. We're all fascinated with, again, their independence and their music and their ability to live life in like sort of a deeper way. And at the same time, they're still so unaccepted. And so there's this which also adds to the fact that they're not very well understood, that we don't know much about them. Then there is such a mystique. I mean, it's hard to understand the people when you're actually not really willing to take them into the folds of society and get to know them. And in Europe, in fact, I can speak in Bucharest in particular, they still live quite separately from the main population. They live in these sort of like outskirts neighborhoods called mahalas, where they play their music and they live their lives. A lot of them actually work in these outskirts of town and really only venture out to, for example, play in taverns or do pottery, or, like they have these jobs that do take them outside of their own neighborhoods, but generally you don't get to see them very often, in terms of being integrated with society. You don't see them in restaurants unless they're generally playing music. So
it's interesting, isn't it? Even in modern day, how we can be so spaced apart from these minorities. We have similar situations up here in Canada, of course, with the Indigenous. And you read about these peoples that are around the world that are really not part of the general going on. It's really interesting. So
absolutely.
I really enjoyed reading that part of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just thought of the name of the book. It's called Princess Among Men. So
okay.
It just came to me. Yeah.
So how does your writing process go? Is your research and your writing, are they sort of intertwined, or do you do most of the research up front? When I write it, it's sort of like I start from what I want to learn about, and then it just kind of seeps into the story, and I'm constantly researching. Is that how it works for you?
Yeah, so very different for both books, because I think with my first book, I did it all pretty much up front. I was also very fortunate to be able to rely on a lot of personal stories, which my mother in particular, who is the subject of this novel, of The Girl They Left Behind, these stories that she tells so beautifully and colorfully. And so there was a lot for me to work with there. And then it was really supplementing with a lot of books that I read, yes, on Romania's World War II history. With the second book, actually, the story went through quite a few drafts that I've been working on for actually several years, even before my first book was published. And so at one point, it changed a little bit of direction in terms of becoming much more focused on World War II and the Hungarian uprising. So at that point, I felt that, yes, I did definitely need to go back and immerse myself more deeply into the siege of Budapest, into the Hungarian uprising, so that I can have a much more, well, obviously, to have a deeper idea of really what happened during that time. And I have to say, in addition to doing that, because it was really important to me to kind of bring the story to the reader in a very intimate way. And so I also spend just as much time, if not more time, looking at, every video footage that I could get my hands on, listening to, filmed interviews about the Hungarian Revolution in particular, because that part was not quite as known to me. And I think, gosh, how fortunate that, we have these resources now. So I was able, it was like really a mosaic, history books, and then sort of really going online and digging through footage and interviews. And those were enormously helpful, because I feel like it really brought to the novel this more like very personal experience of what real people actually went through and endured. So not just giving the turbulence of the time or the logistics of the events, but really how it affected people there in a very personal level. So yeah. I hope that answers.
It totally does. And I've done a lot of listening to interviews and reading journals from the men who are over there doing all this. And it really does give you a deeper sense of
absolutely. Yeah. With my mother, I had, these stories that I sort of heard firsthand. And with the second book, I didn't have the luxury of that.
Right.
And so, there was, as I said, thankfully, all these other resources that I could tap.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting? I like that what you said, that you had started this book and then you wrote the next and then you got back to it. And I find that's one of the weird mysteries about writing, isn't it? You never really know where your brain is going to settle at any one point. Like I've done that before. I've started books and then thought, okay, that one, it needs to be told, but not yet. And I'll come back to it. And then when you do come back to it, there's so much more that you can bring to it. It's very funny, isn't it? Just the whole idea. Because the stories tell themselves to you, and that's how I feel that you have to be the medium for them. You are the storyteller, whereas they are the facts. It's
absolutely.
Yeah, it must have felt.
Yeah, in a way, we're sort of a medium, and you're right. It's actually interesting. I don't know, maybe that sounded strange, a medium, but I do feel like these stories just sort of channel in through you somehow, and you just have to. You're just the avenue for them to kind of come into this world.
Yes, I feel that. I've said that for years, that I'm not really I don't know how I feel about spirituality, and I don't know where I stand and all of that, but I do feel that when I sit down and try to dictate a story that's not supposed to be there, the characters are going to let me know. And they're going to take me to places that I didn't plan to go. And I just love that part. I love to be taken on this adventure like what you've done. So, and did you have to, well, you couldn't have done it this year, but do you have to go back and do research? Have you been back since you left Romania at age 13? Have you gone back?
No, I have not. And in fact, my family had a trip planned there for last summer, for summer of 2020. Which of course was tabled. And so, no, I have not. I've been back since then several times, but I have not been back in probably, I have to say 17, 20 years, which sounds like a really long time. And I know that Eastern Europe, especially Romania, has changed so much since that time. But so I do hope to get that trip back on track. Not this summer, because my book is actually launching this summer, but hopefully the one after.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, my husband and I actually planning a solo trip for our anniversary later in the year, which hopefully will get off the ground. So we'll see, but yeah.
Hopefully we'll be able to cross borders and go to places sometime.
Yes, I miss Canada, by the way, so much. I was in Montreal last October when I spoke at the Jewish Public Library, and it was actually my first time in Montreal. And I just fell in love with it. It was just amazing. So and I made some good friends there. So I'm dying to get back.
Oh yes, well, Canadians are always friendly and always wanting to meet new people. So what was I going to say about that? What about now that you're just publishing? This is how it works for me on my page, and I know the people that are watching right now know what I'm talking about. As soon as the book comes out, they read it in 2 days, and then they say, "What's next?" So. Right. What about you? Have you started thinking about what's coming next?
Yeah, so I've been working on a third book, and it's really early. It's like baby inception stages, and I'm still really immersed in research. But essentially, this one takes place in a Soviet Gulag camp in the 1950s under Stalin's rule, and it centers on two women from very completely different backgrounds. One is a former seamstress, and one is a somewhat prolific writer, novelist, who is actually accused of being a counter-revolutionary. So they both end up in this very bleak place at the same time, and form an unlikely relationship. At first based on need, and then eventually because they find a way to actually save each other and really support each other through this very horrific time. Ultimately, the two of them combine their talents, and I can't say much more about it, but they combine their talents to find a way to actually bring light and hopefulness to the larger community of this camp.
So I'll be looking forward to that. Would that be like in a year or 2 years, do you think?
Gosh, I mean, I'm hoping for a year. I'm hoping for a year. Now that things are sort of back on track with COVID, I am really actually looking forward to sort of like not having the distractions that have sort of contributed to, have not allowed me to work as quickly as I'd like to during this past year.
Yeah.
I have, as you know, during this past year, we've all been homeschooling from home, and my husband's been working from home as well. My younger son has some special needs, so it really required me to kind of like make up a lot of the gaps that he was used to, or more like direct academic assistance that he was used to getting in his class. Suddenly I had to kind of fill that gap. So it was a difficult time. And in fact, I wrote most of this book, or I shouldn't say that I wrote it, but the final draft actually came to the finish line during the year of COVID. So I'm actually kind of amazed that I could pull it off.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to be here.
Yes. Well, I'm in awe of moms. My girls are all grown up and moved out. So for me, it was a big distraction. Things like this, like being online, zooming all over into libraries and book clubs and everything, which has been a real privilege and a lot of fun, but it certainly does mess with your writing and your headspace for trying to create new things. But I have to say I'm awfully glad that my girls are grown up, because I watched some of my closest friends suffer through having to live a life while running everybody else's and trying to be creative at the same time. And I couldn't have done it.
Yeah.
So kudos to you for doing that and
Thank
in the
you.
book.
I
Yeah.
wrote at night a great deal. I actually snuck into my husband's vacant office to write while he was working from home in our basement. I was in his office. So it just shows you how strange those times were. And I think once or twice I was like desperate enough, and I literally drove to the beach and sat in my car on a bluff and just typed away on my laptop. So yeah.
I understand. You do what you got to do. Well, congratulations on this book. I'm looking forward to everybody reading it, and I'm sure we'll get some feedback on this page from people that are planning to have it. Maybe you've pre-ordered it. Maybe it's coming in soon. Congratulations, Roxanne.
Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's been, as always, such a pleasure to talk with you.
It's great to see you.
So I hope we can do it again soon.
For sure, for sure. Yes. Well, you take care, and I will talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks, Genevieve.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.